The rain came down the way it always did in New Carver City. Not gently, not dramatically, but with a kind of tired persistence, as though even the weather had given up pretending things would get better. It soaked through newspaper, through cardboard, through the thin cotton of a child's jacket that had once been blue and was now simply the color of too many hard days. Milo stood on the corner of Aldrich and Fifth. His small fist closed tight around everything he had in the world. He opened his hand slowly, the way you open something precious, and counted again. A dollar bill, soft as cloth from being folded and unfolded so many times it had started to look like fabric. 2 quarters, 1 dime, 2 pennies, $1, 62 cents. He'd found the quarters in the crack between 2 park benches. The dime had been sitting in a puddle outside the bus station, and he'd almost missed it. Almost. But Milo had trained his eyes to find small things on the ground the way other children his age trained theirs to find shapes in clouds. The pennies he'd had for 3 days, carrying them like talismans, unwilling to spend them until the hunger became something he couldn't argue with anymore. That time had come. He was 7 years old. He had $1.62. And he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, when Mrs. Tatum from the 2nd floor of the condemned building on Rose Street had pressed half a bread roll into his hands without a word and looked away so neither of them would have to feel the weight of the moment. His mother had the other half. Milo stood in the rain and looked at the restaurant across the street. Rosario's. He'd passed it 100 times. Maybe more. It was the kind of place that made the air smell different, thick with garlic and warm bread and something slow-cooked that reached out from under the door and grabbed you by the stomach. The windows glowed amber in the gray afternoon, and through the glass Milo could see white tablecloths and candles and people who sat without hunching, who lifted their forks without urgency, who had clearly never once counted coins in the rain. He knew what Rosario's was. Even at 7, you knew things in New Carver City that children in other places didn't learn until they were much older. You knew which corners belonged to which men. You knew that certain restaurants didn't have prices on the menu because the people who ate there didn't need to ask. You knew the name Dante Vasquez the way you knew the name of the wind, not because you'd ever seen it, but because you felt its effects everywhere. Rosario's was Dante Vasquez's restaurant. Everyone knew that. The police knew it. The city council knew it. The archbishop probably knew it and said nothing and ate the soup anyway. Milo knew it too. But the smell coming from under that door was something close to unbearable, and his stomach had stopped growling an hour ago, which he'd learned was actually worse than the growling. It meant his body had given up asking. He looked down at the coins again. Maybe soup was cheap. Maybe $1.62 was enough for soup. He didn't know what soup cost at a place like Rosario's. He'd never been inside anywhere with white tablecloths. But soup was just water and vegetables, wasn't it? Water was free. Vegetables weren't much. Surely $1.62 was enough for a bowl of something warm. He was still working through this logic, still standing in the rain with his coins in his palm, when he heard it. The sound of large vehicles. More than one. Moving slowly, deliberately, the way powerful things move when they have no reason to hurry. 2 black SUVs turned onto Aldrich from the north, followed by a third. They were identical. Dark windows, clean despite the rain, moving in formation like a small, expensive military convoy. They pulled up in front of Rosario's with the quiet authority of vehicles that had never once been honked at. The doors opened. Men got out first. 4 of them, 2 from each of the outer vehicles, and Milo watched the way they moved. Scanning, positioning, hands loose at their sides in the particular way of people who were ready. They wore suits that fit too well to be accidents. They wore expressions that fit the same way. Then the middle door opened. Milo had expected someone large. In his imagination, Dante Vasquez had always been enormous. The way monsters in stories are enormous, filling doorframes, blocking light. But the man who stepped out of the SUV was not enormous. He was perhaps 6 feet tall, lean rather than broad, wearing a dark coat that the rain beat it off of like it wouldn't dare soak through. His hair was dark and cut close. His face was the face of a man somewhere in his 40s who had not had an easy 40 years, but who had won most of them. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the front of Rosario's with the expression of a man arriving home rather than arriving at a restaurant. One of his men held an umbrella over him. He ignored it. The thing about Dante Vasquez, Milo would think later, was his stillness. He was the stillest person Milo had ever seen. Not rigid, not frozen, just genuinely, completely still the way old trees are still. As though he had decided long ago that there was no situation in the world that required him to move faster than he chose to. Milo looked at the man. He looked at the restaurant. He looked at the coins in his hand. He thought about his mother, back in that cold room on Rose Street, whose breathing had started to sound like something wet and difficult, who hadn't complained once, who had smiled at him that morning and told him not to worry, which was the thing people said when worry was the only reasonable response to a situation. He stepped off the curb. He crossed the street. Later, the men who had been there, Felix and Caruso, and the two doormen from the outer vehicles, would all describe it differently but all begin the same way. I didn't see the kid until he was already there. As though Milo had simply materialized out of the rain. As though the city itself had produced him from somewhere. Milo walked up to Dante Vasquez, past the first pair of suited men, who were so stunned they didn't react in time, and stopped 3 feet in front of him. He was small. He was soaking wet. His jacket had a tear along one shoulder and his shoes squelched with every step. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He opened his hand. The coins sat in his palm, wet and gleaming. He looked up at Dante Vasquez, all the way up because the man was much taller up close, with eyes that were dark and clear and entirely unafraid, the way only children and the very old and the completely desperate can be unafraid because they have nothing left to calculate. And he asked his question. "Excuse me, sir." His voice was small but steady. "Is $1.62 enough for soup?" The rain fell. Nobody moved. Felix, who had been with Dante Vasquez for 11 years and had seen things that had permanently rearranged his understanding of human nature, would say afterward that he had never, not once, not in 11 years, seen the boss go still. Because Dante Vasquez was already still. What happened in that moment was something different. The man seemed to stop existing in time for just a second. Not frozen, not shocked, but somewhere else. Somewhere far away and long ago. His eyes, which were usually the eyes of a man who was always already 3 steps into the next thing, became the eyes of someone who had just been handed a photograph they thought had burned. He looked at the boy. He looked at the coins. He looked at the boy again. The entire block was silent. Even the rain seemed to soften, as though it too was waiting. Then Dante Vasquez took his hands out of his coat pockets, and he said something that none of his men had ever heard him say before, in any context, to any person in 11 years. "Come inside." The inside of Rosario's smelled exactly the way the outside had promised. Milo stepped through the door and stopped walking just for a second because the warmth hit him all at once. The warmth and the smell, garlic and wine and something roasting, the kind of smell that is not just food but safety, that speaks to some ancient part of the brain that recognizes shelter before the thinking mind catches up. He stood there in his wet shoes on the marble floor and breathed it in, and for just that second, forgot to be afraid of anything. The restaurant went quiet when they entered. Not the comfortable quiet of a place winding down. The specific, loaded quiet of a room full of people who suddenly understand that something is happening that they don't have a script for. Waiters paused mid-step. A woman at a corner table lowered her wine glass very carefully. 2 men in expensive suits near the bar turned in unison, saw Dante, saw the boy, and turned back to the bar with the practiced nonchalance of people who had survived in this city by learning not to see things. A man in a white shirt, the maitre d', though Milo didn't know the word, appeared from nowhere and began moving toward them with a particular expression of someone managing a crisis in real time. "Mr. Vasquez, welcome, we have your usual." His eyes landed on Milo. His sentence ended without a period. "Corner booth," Dante said. 2 menus. Of course. The man's face reorganized itself into something professional. Right away. Felix fell into step just behind Dante's left shoulder, which was where he always walked, and leaned slightly forward. "Boss." His voice was barely a murmur. Dante didn't look at him. "Sit with Caruso at the bar." Felix opened his mouth, closed it. He had been with this man for 11 years, and he knew the precise texture of an order that was not open for discussion. He peeled off without another word, though he kept his eyes on the corner booth, the way a man keeps his eyes on a thing he doesn't understand but knows is important. Dante led the boy to the corner. He took the seat that faced the room, always in every restaurant in every place, and gestured for Milo to sit across from him. Milo slid onto the leather bench and sat straight, the way his mother had taught him to sit, because how you carry yourself is the only thing nobody can take from you, which was something she said often and which Milo was beginning to understand was advice that came from experience. The menus came. They were large and cream-colored and had no prices. Milo looked at his menu for a moment, then looked up. "I can't read all the words," he said without embarrassment. "Some of them." Dante looked at the boy across the table. Up close, in the warm light of the restaurant, he could see things the rain had hidden. The dark circles under eyes that were too old for a 7-year-old's face. The careful way the boy held himself. Not tense, but managed. The posture of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as was necessary, and not 1 inch more. The jacket with the torn shoulder. The shoes that had been dried out and re-wetted so many times the leather had given up its original shape entirely. He had seen this before. Not here. Not in this restaurant. But in a mirror a long time ago. "The soup tonight is roasted tomato," Dante said. "With basil. There's also a broth, chicken with small pasta. Which sounds better?" Milo considered this with the seriousness of someone making an important decision. "The chicken one," he said. "My mom makes chicken soup when she can. Or she used to." Small pause. "She's sick." Dante said nothing. He set down his menu. He looked at the boy in the way that he looked at things when he was actually paying attention. Completely, without the divided focus that most people operated with, their thoughts always partly somewhere else. When Dante Vasquez looked at you like that, people who knew him found it unnerving. Milo didn't find it unnerving. He looked back with the same directness. A waiter appeared. Dante ordered the chicken broth for Milo, a full bowl with bread. He ordered himself an espresso. The waiter disappeared. "What's your name?" Dante asked. "Milo." "How old are you, Milo?" 7. "I'll be 8 in March." He looked at the table for a second, then back up. "How old are you?" At the bar, Felix inhaled sharply. Caruso beside him went very still. Dante Vasquez looked at the boy for a moment. And then, not a smile exactly, but something in the region of one, something that moved through the lower half of his face and was gone before it fully arrived. 43, he said. "That's very old," Milo said, not unkindly. "Yes," Dante agreed. "It is." The bread came first. Warm, in a cloth-lined basket, with butter. Milo looked at it the way a person looks at something they want very badly but aren't sure they're allowed to have. "Eat," Dante said. Milo ate. He was careful about it. Not shoveling, not frantic, but with the focused attention of someone for whom eating was a serious activity that deserved respect. He took one piece of bread and buttered it neatly, and he ate it in small bites, and it was one of the most deliberate things Dante had ever watched a child do. The soup arrived. The bowl was wide and white, the broth golden, the small pasta shapes settled at the bottom like a city submerged in amber. The smell of it reached across the table. Milo picked up his spoon. And then he did something that made the room tilt slightly on its axis, at least for the man sitting across from him. He tore a small piece of bread from the second roll in the basket and set it aside, carefully, on the edge of the bread plate, apart from everything else. He looked at it for just a second, a quick, private look, and then he began eating his soup. Dante watched that piece of bread sitting on the edge of the plate. He didn't say anything. Instead, he went somewhere else. Not far. Just backward. 35 years. The Garrow Street neighborhood, before they tore it down to build the overpass. A different rain, a different cold. A boy of 8 in a coat that didn't close properly at the front because the zipper had broken in October, and it was now February. Standing at the service door of a house on the nice end of the block. Not the front door, He hadn't been bold enough for the front door, knocking. Waiting. Knocking again. The door opened. A man in a cardigan and reading glasses looked down at him. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I was wondering if..." The door closed. Not slammed. Just closed. As though he hadn't been worth the energy of a slam. He'd stood there for a long moment in the February cold, and something had shifted in him. Not broken. He was careful even now, even in memory, to call it a shift and not a break. Something had moved inside him, like a door swinging closed on a room he'd previously kept open, and he had walked back down those steps and not looked back, and had begun from that day to understand the world differently. The espresso arrived. Dante lifted it and drank without tasting it. Milo was more than halfway through his soup. He ate with total concentration, the way children eat when they're truly hungry rather than performing hunger for adults. Dante noticed he'd eaten around the small pasta shapes, saving them, eating the broth first. Strategy even here. "You said your mother is sick," Dante said. Milo nodded, swallowing. "She has a cough that doesn't stop. It's been 3 weeks. She says it's fine, but I can hear it at night and it doesn't sound fine." He looked at his soup. "She doesn't eat much, so I can have more. But I don't want her to do that. Where's your father?" The boy's face didn't crumple or harden. It just accepted the question the way a surface accepts rain. "He left when I was 4. I don't really remember him." Silence. "Where do you live?" Dante asked. "Rose Street. The building with the boards on the windows on the ground floor. 3rd floor though, it's okay up there. Mrs. Tatum is on the 2nd floor and she's nice." He finished the last of the broth, then looked at the small pile of pasta shapes remaining in the bowl with something like affection. He ate them slowly, one at a time. Dante said nothing for a long moment. He turned the espresso cup in his saucer once, twice. A habit Felix would have recognized, the motion he made when he was deciding something. He looked at the piece of bread sitting apart on the edge of the plate. The piece Milo hadn't touched. "That piece of bread," Dante said. "You're not going to eat it." It wasn't quite a question. Milo glanced at it. A quick flash of something. Not shame, not guilt, just the honest exposure of a private thing made visible. "It's for my mom," he said simply. "I was going to put it in my pocket. Is that okay?" Dante looked at the boy for a long time. Felix, watching from the bar, would later say he'd seen a lot of things in 11 years. He'd seen Dante Vasquez make decisions that changed the shape of this city. He'd seen him be merciful in ways that surprised you, and ruthless in ways that didn't. He'd seen him at his most powerful and at his most human. But he had never seen the man look the way he looked right now. Like something in him was being rearranged. Dante turned and looked at the waiter by the service station. One look. The waiter was at the table in under 10 seconds. "Pack up a full dinner to go," Dante said. "Soup, the chicken, bread, whatever the dessert is tonight. Box it properly." "Of course, Mr. Vasquez." The waiter disappeared. Dante looked back at Milo. Milo was looking at him very carefully, in the measuring way of children, who are better than most adults at knowing when something real is happening. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Dante said. "I have $1.62, Milo said with dignity. He placed the coins on the table between them, still damp, still gleaming. "For the soup." Dante looked at the coins. He didn't move to take them. He became, for just a moment, absolutely still. Not the controlled stillness of a powerful man at rest. Something older than that. Something that lived below power, below reputation, below 43 years of building walls between himself and the boy in the February cold who had knocked on a door and been closed out of. Felix leaned toward Caruso at the bar. "What are we doing here?" he whispered. Caruso shook his head slowly. He didn't know either. But something in his chest told him that whatever this was, they were watching the beginning of something. He just didn't know what. Dante pushed the coins back across the table to Milo. "Keep them," he said. By 7 o'clock the next morning it was everywhere. Not in newspapers. Not on the news. The kind of everywhere that moves faster than media and slower than rumor. The specific frequency of information that travels through a city's underworld like electricity through old wiring. Present everywhere, traceable nowhere. Dante Vasquez fed a homeless kid. Sat with him for an hour. Sent him home with food. Didn't take a penny. In the kitchen of a restaurant on the east side, two men who ran collections for the Ferraro operation lowered their coffee cups and looked at each other. In a parking garage on the north end, a conversation stopped mid-sentence while both parties processed what they'd just been told. In a penthouse on Meridian Avenue, a man named Victor Sorin, who had pale eyes and the kind of smile that arrived before it was earned and stayed after it was welcome, heard the story from his second-in-command, a nervous young man named Gregor, and said nothing for a long time. Then he poured himself a glass of water. Drank it. Set it down. A child, he said. 7 years old, Gregor confirmed. Homeless. Dante sat with him personally. Stayed 40 minutes. Had the kitchen pack food to go. Victor turned to the window. New Carver City spread out below him, gray and wet, going about its business. And the boy's name? Milo. The mother is a woman named Clara. They're in a building on Rose Street. Condemned, technically, but the city hasn't moved them. The mother is sick. Respiratory, apparently. Victor looked at the city for another long moment. His smile returned, small and calculating, the way a card player smiles when the other person at the table has just revealed more than they meant to. Interesting, he said. He filed it away. On Rose Street, in a third-floor apartment where the radiator worked on 2 out of every 3 days, and the window overlooking the alley was covered with a piece of plastic sheeting that billowed inward when the wind found the gap at the edge. Clara was already awake when the knock came. She was always awake before Milo. She'd made it a practice, a discipline, the same way she'd made a practice of many small dignities. Being awake first, being dressed before he opened his eyes, having water on the stove even if there was nothing to put in it. Keeping shape to the days. Keeping the feeling of normalcy alive through the application of routine. The way you keep a fire alive by feeding it whatever is available, because the alternative is darkness. She was wrapping herself in the sweater. The thick one, the one that had been her mother's and still, if she believed in such things, held some warmth that belonged to someone who had loved her, when the cough took her. It bent her forward over the small table, one hand braced on the surface, the other pressed to her mouth. It lasted 40 seconds. When it passed, she straightened slowly, her eyes watering, her breath coming in measured pulls. She looked at the window. Gray light. Early. Milo was still sleeping, curled on the mattress in the corner with his knees drawn up. His face slack and young in a way it wasn't always when he was awake. Awake. He had the eyes of someone who was paying attention. Sleep, he was just a child. She'd eaten the food he'd brought home last night. More food than she'd seen in one place in weeks. Chicken and vegetables and bread and a small pastry wrapped in paper. She'd asked him where it was from and he'd said simply, "The restaurant on Aldrich. A man gave it to me." She'd asked what man and he'd said, "A very still man," which was not the answer she'd expected. And she'd looked at him for a moment and then decided that some things revealed themselves in time and you didn't need to pull at them. She'd eaten slowly, carefully. The way you eat when your body isn't used to real food and you know it needs to be reintroduced rather than overwhelmed. She'd left some for morning. She was heating it now when the knock came. 2 knocks. Firm, not urgent. She turned off the burner. Moved to the door. Looked through the gap where the peephole had been before it fell out and never got replaced. 2 men in dark coats. Not police. Police knocked differently, with authority, with the implicit message that the door would open one way or another. These men knocked like people who knew they might not be let in and had accepted that possibility in advance. One of them was holding a white envelope. The other had a piece of paper, a card maybe with something printed on it. "Miss Clara," said the one with the envelope. Not a question. His voice was low, neutral, not threatening. "We're here on behalf of someone who wanted to make sure you were taken care of. We're not here to cause any trouble. We'd like to leave this with you." She stood at the door and said nothing. "The envelope has money in it," the man continued. "Cash. No strings attached. The card has a doctor's number. A real one, not a clinic. Private doctor. Already paid for. You can call and make an appointment and there's nothing owed. Clara stared at the door. Her hand was on the deadbolt. Who sent you, she said. Was. Someone who met your son last night. She stood very still. The cough was pressing at the back of her throat again and she swallowed against it. She thought about her son, sleeping in the corner with his young face. About the food he'd brought home. About the very still man. She thought about every time in her life that she'd accepted help from people she didn't understand and how it had landed, and about the difference between charity and a transaction, and about how you were supposed to know which one you were being offered. She opened the door 6 inches. The chain was still on. The two men looked at her with the same expression, carefully neutral, professionally calm, but with something underneath that she hadn't expected. Something that looked around the eyes. Faintly like the expression of people who had been told to be kind and were, to their own mild surprise, finding it possible. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the card. She took neither. She looked at the men. Tell whoever sent you, she said quietly, that I appreciate it. But we don't know each other. And I don't take things from people I don't know. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment, the cough finally breaking through. Her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the ceiling of the small kitchen. Milo's voice came from the mattress, sleepy and immediate. Mom! I'm here, she said. Go back to sleep. Across the city, in a penthouse that looked like the concept of money made architectural, Dante Vasquez stood at the window and watched the morning arrive over New Carver City with the same expression he brought to most things. Total attention, no performance. His phone was on the glass table behind him. On the screen was a still image from a security camera. Grainy, angle wrong but unmistakable. The Rowe Street building. Last night. A small figure in a torn jacket walking alone through the rain. Head down, something tucked under one arm. The food box. Going home. What you could see if you looked closely at the image, and Dante had looked closely, was that the boy was not hurrying. Despite the rain. Despite the cold. Despite being 7 years old and alone on a dark street. He was walking at a steady, careful pace, one arm cradling the box, keeping it level. Keeping the food from spilling. Dante turned from the window. Felix was at the table, working through the morning reports. The routine data of running an operation the size of theirs, the numbers and names and movements that constituted the daily weather of the empire. He looked up when Dante moved. The Sorin meeting is at 11, Felix said. Dante poured coffee. The deal with Victor Sorin had been in negotiation for 6 weeks. A significant expansion, a merger of operations across 3 sectors of the city. On paper it was the most strategically sound move Dante had made in a decade. Victor Sorin was functional, reliable, and ruthless in the precise manner that made for stable business partnerships. Everyone who knew anything expected Dante to sign. Cancel it, Dante said. Felix put down his pen. Carefully. The way you put down something breakable when the surface beneath it has suddenly become uncertain. The meeting, he said. And the deal. Dante drank his coffee. He was looking at the security footage still. The grainy image of a small boy in the rain carrying a box of food home to his sick mother. I want out of the Sorin deal. All of it. Draft the withdrawal. The room was very quiet. Dante, Felix said, which was itself unusual. He rarely used the name, almost always boss. Victor Sorin is not going to take that cleanly. I know. He's been counting on this arrangement. His East End operations are structured around the assumption that this deal closes. If we pull out, then his East End operations are his problem. Dante set down his coffee cup. Draft the withdrawal. Felix looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of a man who has worked alongside another man for long enough to know when an argument is not possible, but who needs to register, at least for the record, that he is not simply accepting something without question. This is about the boy, he said. Dante didn't answer, which was, with Dante, the same as answering. Felix picked up his pen. He looked at the legal pad in front of him. He wrote 2 words at the top of a new page. Sorin withdrawal, and paused with the pen resting on the paper. Felix, Dante said. Yeah. Find out about the mother, Clara. What she actually needs. Don't send men to her door again, she'll refuse it. Find another way. Felix nodded. He was writing now, the pen moving in the careful, efficient shorthand he'd developed over a decade of working for a man who communicated in precise, dense sentences that needed to be captured exactly. And Milo? Felix asked. Dante was quiet. Outside the window, the city moved and turned and hummed with its 10,000 lives, all of them arranging and rearranging themselves in the patterns of survival, ambition, love, fear, hunger. The same patterns that had been running in human cities since human cities began, always the same forces, always the same stakes. Make sure he's safe, Dante said. Without him knowing. Felix looked up from the legal pad. That's all, he asked. Dante looked at the grainy image on his phone. A boy in the rain carrying a box carefully level, unhurrying, crossing alone through the dark city toward a mother who needed what was inside. That's all, he said. The withdrawal notice reached Victor Sorin at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by a person, which would have been a message in itself, but by a document couriered, formal, clipped and precise. 2 pages. Legal language. Effective immediately. Victor read it twice. Then he set it on his desk and looked at it the way you look at something you need to understand fully before you respond to it, because your response, once given, will not be retrievable. Gregor, he said. Gregor appeared in the doorway. Tell me about the boy again, Victor said. Everything. Gregor told him. Name, age, location, the mother's condition, the building on Rose Street. The story of the soup. The security footage. All of it again in more detail than before. Victor listened without moving. When Gregor finished, Victor stood up and walked to the window. A man doesn't walk away from the deal of his decade for a principle, he said, to the window, to the city. He walks away because something changed his math. And when a man like Dante Vasquez changes his math because of a child. He turned around. His pale eyes were light and flat. That child is leverage. Gregor shifted his weight. He was 26 years old and had been in Victor's employ for 3 years, and he had learned, in those 3 years, to identify the exact moment when a plan shifted from complicated to something else. He recognized the texture of that moment right now. Victor. I'm not going to hurt him, Victor said, with the patient tone of a man clarifying something obvious. I'm not a savage. The boy sits in a room for a few hours. Dante calls. We renegotiate. Everyone goes home. He spread his hands. Simple. This is just a conversation. With a different currency. Gregor said nothing. By 3 o'clock on Wednesday, Victor had a location. Milo's route from the Rose Street building to the corner store where he sometimes ran errands for Mrs. Tatum in exchange for the occasional meal. Timing. The gap. Half a block where the foot traffic thinned and the angle from the nearest camera was wrong. By 4 o'clock, he had 3 men ready. At 4:17, a car pulled up alongside a small boy walking alone on the edge of Caldwell Street, and a man leaned out and said something, and the boy, who had been taught not to talk to strangers but who had also been living alone in a city long enough to know that sometimes the thing you were taught and the thing in front of you didn't match, was handed a choice that wasn't really a choice. The car drove away. The corner of Caldwell Street was empty. Victor's phone rang at 4:31. He answered it. Victor. Dante's voice on the other end was the same as it always was. Even unhurried, occupying the frequency of someone who had all the time in the world because time had long ago decided not to argue with him. I hear you've been making interesting decisions today. Victor smiled. He had expected anger. Fear even. The thin high note that came into people's voices when something they loved was threatened. He had a whole conversation prepared around those responses. Dante. Good of you to call. I was hoping we could. He's eating dinner right now, Dante said. Victor paused. I'm sorry. Milo. He's in a room 2 blocks from where your men picked him up. He has a hot meal, a blanket, and 3 of my people sitting with him making sure he isn't frightened. He's been there for 40 minutes. Beep. I had him out of your warehouse in 12. The smile left Victor's face. He looked at the phone. He looked at Gregor. How? He started. I've had eyes on him since the soup, Dante said. Did you think I wouldn't? Not contempt in the voice. Something worse, a kind of patience, the patience of a teacher who has asked a question and is genuinely waiting for the student to arrive at the correct answer. I knew you'd hear about it. I knew what you'd think it meant. I've been waiting to see what you'd do with that thought. Victor said nothing. His hand, he noticed, was very still on the phone. Here's what I want you to understand, Dante said. The boy asked me for soup. That's the beginning and end of his involvement in anything. He's a child. His mother is sick. He had $1.62 and he asked a question and I gave him dinner. That's all it is. The voice hadn't changed. It was still even. Still unhurried. But something had entered it. A kind of deliberate weight, a density, the way certain kinds of quiet are louder than noise. By touching him, you've made it into something else. Dante, let's be reasonable. Open your laptop, Dante said. Your business account, the one registered under the holding company on Aldrich. Look at your incoming messages. Victor looked at Gregor. Gregor crossed the room and opened the laptop on the side table. His eyes moved across the screen. His face changed. What is this? Victor said. Those are 6 messages, Dante said. From 6 different business partners of yours. All sent in the last 2 hours. All saying the same thing more or less. That they've received certain information and they need time to evaluate the relationship going forward. Victor stared at the screen over Gregor's shoulder. 6 names. 6 messages. The scaffold of his East End operation. All swaying at once. And your attorney, Dante continued. The one who handles the arrangements on the Kellner Street properties. He's received a visit from a journalist this afternoon. A freelancer. But well connected. Asking about the zoning irregularities on those properties. Which apparently someone has documented very carefully. Gregor looked at Victor. Victor looked at the wall. The police department contact on the 9th floor, Dante said. He's been asked to attend an internal review meeting tomorrow morning. For a routine audit. Which happens to overlap with the dates of 3 transactions you needed him to look away from. Silence. Victor, Dante said. I didn't shoot anyone. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply organized some information that already existed, and made sure it found its proper audience. Another pause. You know what the difference is between a powerful man and a dangerous one. Victor was staring at the wall. A powerful man needs his power to move things, Dante said. A dangerous man already moved them 3 days ago before you made your decision. He was just waiting to see if he'd need to. The phone felt heavier in Victor's hand than it had a minute ago. I want Milo back on his street, Dante said. Fed, unharmed, unfrightened. In the next hour. In exchange for which I will recall the journalist, calm the business partners, and let the internal review find nothing of interest. Stop. Let that sit. Or you can make a different choice. I won't tell you what happens then because I don't think you need me to. Victor closed his eyes. Behind them was the entire architecture of what he had spent 15 years building. Every arrangement, every leverage point, every careful structure. And the very clear sensation of all of it suddenly being visible to someone who had, until now, had no reason to look at it carefully. The boy will be home by 5, Victor said. Good, Dante said. Pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Victor. Yes. If you ever. Dante started. He stopped. The pause was different from the others. Not calculated. Something personal moving through it. The way wind moves through a space it has found unexpectedly open. He asked me for soup. He came up to me, 7 years old, soaking wet, $1.62 in his hand, and he asked me a question without any fear. Do you understand what that is? Do you understand how rare that is? Victor said nothing. Don't ever give him a reason to learn fear that way, Dante said. Not from us. Not from this world we built. He doesn't belong to it. The call ended. Victor stood in the middle of his penthouse and looked at his phone and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and humbling sensation of having misunderstood something completely. He had looked at Dante Vasquez's compassion and seen weakness. He had been wrong about what he was looking at. He pressed a number on his phone. "Gregor," he said when the line opened. "Take the boy home." Milo arrived back on Rose Street at 4:58, unharmed, and carrying a second box of food, which he had requested, politely but firmly, from the very confused men who were driving him home, on the grounds that his mother would be wondering where he was and it would be better if he came back with something. The men, who had received instructions from Victor himself to give the boy whatever he wanted, had stopped at a deli and let him choose. He arrived at the Rose Street building and went up the stairs at his usual steady pace, the food box level in his arms, and knocked on the apartment door the way he always did. 3 times, then once, so his mother would know it was him. Clara opened the door. She looked at him. She looked at the box. She looked at him again. "Milo," she said. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, which was their language for, "I know you were worried and I'm sorry and everything is okay and I'm here." She stepped back to let him in. She pressed a hand to his face briefly as he passed, checking the universal parental check, touching what you love to confirm it is real and present and whole. He set the box on the table. He sat down. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the apartment was small and cold and the radiator was doing its inconsistent best, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Milo said, "The man from the restaurant. He has people looking out for us. I think that's just how it is now." Clara looked at her son, at his steady eyes, at the certainty in his 7-year-old face. She sat down across from him. She thought about the men at the door with the envelope, about the food that kept appearing, about the very still man her son had walked up to in the rain and asked his question. She thought about what it meant when a thing you were afraid of turned out to be the thing keeping you safe. "Okay," she said finally, quietly. It was not agreement exactly. It was the sound of a woman deciding to let something she didn't fully understand exist alongside her, for now, because the alternative was to stand in the cold alone. She opened the food box. 3 weeks passed. In the life of a city, 3 weeks is nothing. A blink, a page turn, a few cycles of weather moving through without stopping. New Carver City went on doing what it did, humming and grinding and breaking and repairing, its 10,000 lives pressing against each other in the dark, looking for warmth, looking for money, looking for the small reliefs that make the large difficulties bearable. But on Rose Street, 3 weeks was a long time. The change had come the way real changes usually come. Not announced, not sudden, but as a series of small facts that accumulated into a new reality before you had time to resist it. A doctor who appeared at the building door one morning, not Dante's men but a woman in a coat with a medical bag, who had Clara's name on a card and said she was from a community health program and was doing check-ins in the area. Clara, who had grown up understanding that gifts from unknown sources always carried a price, had spent 2 days deciding whether to trust this. On the 3rd day, when the cough woke Milo at 2 in the morning and he sat beside her rubbing her back with his small hand and she felt the helplessness of having nothing to give him but her presence, she had called the number. The diagnosis was pneumonia, progressing. The doctor had been direct about it, which Clara respected. She had been given medication and a treatment plan and follow-up appointments, all arranged, all covered. When she asked who had arranged it, the doctor said, "A community program." When Clara pressed, the doctor said, "I honestly don't know the specific donor, Ms. Clara. I just know your care is paid for. Let's focus on getting you better." The medication worked. Not instantly. Nothing works instantly. But by the end of week 2, Clara was sleeping through the night, and the wet sound had left her breathing, and she was eating real meals, and she could walk to the window and look down at the street without having to stop and rest at the sill. The apartment had changed too, though she hadn't asked for that either. It had happened through Mrs. Tatum first. Mrs. Tatum, who had, with quiet excitement, told Clara that someone had paid the building owner 6 months of back rent and arranged basic repairs, and that the heating system on the 3rd floor had been inspected and fixed, and that the boarded windows on the ground floor were being replaced. The owner, a man named Pratt who lived in the suburbs and collected rent by mail, had apparently received a visit from someone and had decided, with unusual motivation, to make the building livable. Clara had stood in the kitchen and processed this for a long time. She had thought about what it meant to be helped by someone you didn't ask for help. About the difference between being saved and being seen. About whether the two could be the same thing if the person doing it was careful enough. She thought about her son. Milo had started school. This was the thing he hadn't told her about at first. The paperwork that had appeared, the enrollment confirmation, the school one bus stop away that had a place available in the second grade starting Monday. He'd shown her the papers at dinner, carefully watching her face. "It's a good school," he said. "I looked at it. The building is nice." She'd looked at the papers. At the school's name, printed at the top. The address. At the enrollment date. "Milo," she said. "I know we didn't plan it," he said. Which was 7-year-old for. "I know I maybe should have asked you first, but I also knew you'd say yes." She'd laughed. A real laugh, the kind that surprised her, because she hadn't laughed that way in long enough that she'd started to think the part of her that did it might have gone somewhere unreachable. She'd pulled him close and pressed her chin to the top of his head and felt his arms go around her waist and held on. He'd been going for a week and a half now. He wore a uniform, bought, she assumed, the same way everything else had been arranged, and shoes that fit correctly, real leather shoes that didn't squelch, and he carried a backpack that was slightly too big for him but which he had insisted on because it had a front pocket shaped like an owl. He walked to the bus stop every morning with the same steady, unhurried pace. He walked everywhere, looking at the city around him with his paying attention eyes. He came home with homework and opinions about his teachers and an ongoing report on a classroom hamster named Gerald, whose habits he was monitoring with the focused interest of someone who had always wanted a pet and was receiving a neighbor's pet as an acceptable substitute. He was, Clara thought, watching him exactly himself. Exactly who he had always been. Careful, unafraid, honest, deliberate. Nothing that had happened in the last 3 weeks had made him smaller or larger than he was. He wore the change around him easily, like a coat that fit. She was learning, she thought, something about the nature of her son. That the boy who had walked up to a stranger in the rain with $1.62 and asked a question without fear had always been exactly that boy. And that whatever came after was simply the world responding, slowly, correctly, to what he was. It was a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks and 2 days since the soup, when Milo passed Rosario's on his way back from the corner store. He hadn't specifically planned to pass it. The route wasn't direct. He'd gone 1 block out of his way, which he would have acknowledged if asked, though he might have said it was just because the other street had better puddles to avoid, which was not entirely a lie. He stopped on the sidewalk across from the amber glow of the windows. The restaurant was occupied but not full. Mid-afternoon, the gap between lunch and dinner service. White tablecloths, candles, the smell reaching him through the closed door and across the street the way it always had, warm and permanent and full of something his body still recognized as the smell of being safe. He looked through the window. Corner booth. Dante Vasquez was sitting in the corner booth, alone, a cup in front of him, looking at papers spread across the white tablecloth with his usual expression of total attention. He was wearing a different dark coat. His phone was face down on the table. He wasn't performing being alone. He simply was, completely, without apology, the way he existed in any context. Milo looked at him, as though he felt the weight of being looked at, as perhaps very still people do, having fewer distractions. Dante lifted his eyes from the papers. Through the glass, across the empty street, their eyes met. Milo didn't move. Dante didn't move. Car passed between them. When it cleared, they were still looking at each other. Dante gave a nod. Single. The nod of someone acknowledging a thing that is real. Milo grinned. It was the kind of grin that belonged entirely to 7-year-olds, wide and gap-toothed and incapable of pretension, the pure physical expression of something good. It took over his whole face. It was the kind of grin that, if you were on the receiving end of it, did something to the center of your chest that you might not be able to name immediately but that you would feel for hours afterward. He crossed the street. He pushed through the door. The warmth hit him the way it had the first time, but this time he didn't stop. He walked through it, past the maitre d' who recognized him and said nothing but moved very slightly to the side, past the tables with their careful guests, straight to the corner booth. He sat down across from Dante Vasquez. He set his backpack, the one with the owl pocket, on the seat beside him. He reached into the front pocket of his uniform trousers and took out what he had. He placed it on the table between them with the deliberateness of someone conducting an important transaction. $3 bills folded once. Quarter. 3 dimes. $3.55. He looked at Dante. His face was serious. I came back to pay for the soup, he said. And the bread. I don't know exactly what it cost, but I think this covers it. He paused. There might be some left over. You can keep it. Felix, standing at the service entrance because he was always somewhere nearby, closed his eyes briefly. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Dante looked at the money on the table. He looked at the boy. He looked at the money again. Something happened in the room then. Not dramatic, not visible, but real, the way invisible things are real. A shift in the air. Settling. Dante picked up one of the dollar bills. He held it for a moment, looking at it. Soft with handling, folded and refold the way money gets when a person carries it for a long time and takes it out and looks at it often. He set it back down. Where did you get this? He asked. Mrs. Kowalski on the 4th floor, Milo said. I carried her groceries 4 times. She paid me 75 cents each time. And Mr. Tatum? He's not related to Mrs. Tatum, they just have the same name, I asked. He paid me $1 to help him move a shelf. He thought about it. And I found a quarter near the bus stop. I was going to save it, but I already have 6 cents at home, so I'm okay. Dante looked at the boy for a long time. You carried groceries to pay for soup, he said. I owe it, Milo said simply. You paid for mine and I didn't ask you to. So I owe it. He looked directly at Dante with his clear, unafraid eyes. My mom says you always pay what you owe. She says that's the only kind of freedom that belongs to you. Something passed through Dante Vasquez's face. Not fast. It moved through him slowly, the way weather moves through an open landscape, changing the light as it goes. His eyes, which were usually the eyes of a man looking at the next 3 things simultaneously, became for just a moment the eyes of someone who was only here, only now, only in this booth with this child who had carried groceries in order to pay a debt he hadn't incurred. And then, starting somewhere deep, from a place that had been covered over by decades and decisions and the particular weight of the life he had chosen, Dante Vasquez laughed. Not a polite sound. Not a performative sound. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the body before the mind has a chance to curate it, the kind that has nothing to do with being watched or being powerful or being anything other than momentarily, helplessly human. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When it subsided, his eyes were bright and he pressed the back of one hand briefly to his mouth and looked away toward the window and looked back. At the service entrance, Felix stood completely still. He would think about this moment for a long time afterward. He would try to find words for it and mostly fail, but the closest he would come was this. It was the first time in 11 years he looked like he wasn't carrying something. How's your mother? Dante asked when he could. Better, Milo said. A lot better. She laughed yesterday at something on the radio. The real kind of laugh. He looked at the table for a second, then up. I think that was you. Making her better. I don't know how, but I think it was. Dante said nothing. I'm not going to pretend I don't know who you are, Milo said. He was 7, but he said it the way someone much older might say it, with the acknowledgement that honesty, offered cleanly, was a form of respect. I know what people say about you. What do they say? Dante asked. Milo considered. That you're scary, he said. That you own things. That people do what you say. He looked at Dante directly. But you gave me soup. And you gave it back. He touched the money on the table. So I think maybe both things are true at the same time. The restaurant moved quietly around them. A waiter refreshed water at a nearby table. The candles held their small, steady flames. Dante looked at the child across from him. This boy who had $1.62 and an unbroken spirit, and a mother who said that the only freedom that belonged to you was paying what you owed. This boy who had walked up to the most feared man in New Carver City and asked a question without fear, not because he was reckless or naive, but because he understood, in some way that went below words, that his hunger was real and the soup was real and reality was something you had to walk toward rather than away from. Dante had been many things in 43 years. He had made choices that had shaped this city in ways that would never appear in any official history of it. He had been cold and he had been precise and he had been, when it was required, something that people called powerful and meant to be afraid of. He had not, in a very long time, been anyone's reason to feel safe. He reached forward and folded the money, the 3 bills, the quarter, the 3 dimes, and placed it back into Milo's hand. He closed the small fingers around it. "The soup was a gift," he said. "You don't pay for gifts." Milo looked at him. Looked at his closed hand. "Look back." "Then I'll buy you a coffee," he said. "That's not a gift. That's a trade. My mom says trades are different." Felix made a sound at the service entrance that was almost certainly not a laugh and was absolutely a laugh. Dante Vasquez looked at Milo for a moment. "Fine," he said. He signaled the waiter. "1 coffee. And..." He looked at the boy. "What do you want?" Milo's face lit up. "Do they have hot chocolate?" "They have hot chocolate." "Then hot chocolate," Milo said. "And maybe..." He looked toward the bread basket on the service station with a specific hopeful expression of someone asking for something they very much want but are being polite about. "Some bread." The waiter appeared. Dante ordered. The waiter disappeared. They sat across from each other in the corner booth of Rosario's, the Mafia boss and the 7-year-old boy, in the warm amber light, with the candles and the white tablecloths and the rain beginning again outside, soft against the windows. A man who had spent 43 years becoming the thing that the world feared, and a boy who had spent 7 years becoming the thing that did not know how to be afraid of it. The hot chocolate came. Milo wrapped both hands around it. He looked across at Dante. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything," Dante said and meant it. "Were you ever scared?" Milo said. "When you were little. Were you ever scared of things?" The question sat in the air between them. Dante thought of a boy on a doorstep in February. A door closing without a sound. The long walk back down the steps, and the shift that happened in something small and essential, and all the years that had followed from it. "Yes," he said. "A long time ago." "What happened?" Dante looked at him. "I decided to stop being afraid by making sure other things were afraid of me instead." He paused. "It worked. But it cost something." Milo thought about this seriously. "What did it cost?" Dante looked at the boy's hands wrapped around the mug. The owl backpack on the seat. The uniform with the collar slightly askew. The eyes that had walked up to him in the rain with $1.62 and looked at him without flinching. "I'll tell you when you're older," Dante said. Milo accepted this with the nod of someone who recognizes a real answer when they hear it, even if they can't fully unwrap it yet. He drank his hot chocolate. Outside, the rain fell on New Carver City. On the building on Rose Street where a woman named Clara was sleeping deeply and breathing without difficulty. In a warm room. In an apartment where the heat worked. On the streets that belonged to complicated men who were always underneath the complication. Just people who had been hungry once and had made different decisions about what to do with that hunger. In the corner booth. A man who hadn't laughed in years was having hot chocolate and bread with a boy who owed him nothing and had come back anyway. Felix watched from the doorway. A man who can still laugh like that, he thought, hasn't lost everything yet. Maybe he thought that was the point. Maybe it had never been about what you built or what you owned or how still you could stand in a city that moved around you like water around a stone. Maybe. And Felix was not a sentimental man. But here in this amber-lit room, watching his boss share bread with a 7-year-old, he allowed himself to be, briefly. Maybe it was about whether there was still something in you that a child could reach. Whether there was still something left that $1.62 and an honest question could find. Dante Vasquez was smiling. And the room, which had always been warm, was warmer.